4 women had already fled the Bitterroot Mountains, screaming that Theron McCall was a monster. No mail-order bride lasted a single week in his brutal, bone-chilling cabin. Then came Clara. She wasn't the dainty, porcelain-skinned beauty he demanded in his letters. Tipping the scales at over 250 pounds, the town laughed, betting she'd freeze or run by dawn. But they didn't know Clara had absolutely nowhere else to go, and she was done running. The frontier town of Orofino, Idaho Territory, in the late autumn of 1882, was little more than a muddy gash in the wilderness. It was a place built of raw timber, cheap whiskey, and the broken dreams of gold miners. Above the town loomed the Bitterroot Mountains, a jagged spine of dark pines and early snow that swallowed men whole. And up on the highest, most unforgiving ridge lived Theron McCall. Theron was a giant of a man, standing 6'4" in his scuffed leather boots. A brutal encounter with a grizzly bear 5 years prior had left him with 3 jagged white scars tearing across his left cheek, disappearing into a thick, untamed, dark beard. He was a trapper, a logger, and a man who had long ago traded the complications of human society for the brutal honesty of the wilderness. But a man cannot survive a Rocky Mountain winter alone while running a trap line and keeping a cabin from collapsing under the snow. He needed a wife, not for love, but for labor. He had placed an advertisement in the San Francisco Matrimonial News. Over the past month, the Wells Fargo stagecoach, driven by the tobacco-chewing veteran Elias Miller, had brought him 3 different women. The first, a frail seamstress named Mary, took one look at Theron's scarred face and fainted in the mud. She caught the next coach east. The second, a widow named Henrietta, lasted 3 days in his cabin before the isolation, and his booming, impatient temper broke her mind. She walked 10 miles down the mountain in a snow squall just to escape him. The third didn't even make it off the stagecoach when she heard the rumors in the saloon. Now, Theron stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store, his broad shoulders tense beneath a heavy buffalo hide coat, watching the afternoon stagecoach rumble into town. The locals, a mix of grimy prospectors and hardened saloon women, watched him from the shadows, whispering wagers on how many days this new bride would last. Theron clenched his jaw. He had written the agency a furious letter after the last disaster. He demanded a sturdy, capable woman, no weeping willows, no romantics. The stagecoach screeched to a halt, horses snorting plumes of white steam into the freezing October air. Elias Miller swung down from the driver's box, wiping dirt from his brow. He shot Theron a look that was half pity, half amusement. The heavy wooden door of the coach opened. Theron stepped forward, expecting a rugged farm girl, someone with calloused hands and a hard gaze. Instead, Clara Higgins stepped out. The boardwalk went dead silent. Clara was not a sturdy farm girl. She was a woman of immense proportions. She weighed well over 250 pounds, her broad hips and thick waist straining against the dark, practical wool of her traveling dress. Her face was round, her cheeks flushed a bright, nervous pink, and her soft double chin tucked into a heavy woolen scarf. She moved with a slow, deliberate caution as she descended the steep iron steps of the coach, her leather boots sinking deeply into the Orofino mud. A miner near the saloon spat a stream of tobacco juice and snickered loudly. "Looks like McCall ordered a winter hog instead of a wife," laughter erupted along the street. Clara froze, her hands gripping her worn leather satchel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her dark brown eyes, intelligent and wide, darted to the crowd, then settled on the towering, scarred man standing before her. Theron's face flushed dark red beneath his beard. He felt a surge of pure, blinding humiliation and rage. He had asked for a worker, a partner to help him survive. The agency had sent him a woman who looked as though she would have a heart attack just walking up the porch steps. She was a liability. Up on the ridge, if you couldn't pull your own weight, you died. And in Theron's harsh estimation, this woman carried far too much weight to ever pull. "Are you Theron McCall?" Clara asked, her voice surprisingly steady, carrying the refined, clipped accent of a born Bostonian. "I am," Theron growled, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at Elias Miller. "Put her trunk back on the coach, Elias." Clara's eyes widened. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Theron snapped, looking back at her with eyes as cold as slate. "I don't know what kind of joke the agency's playing, but you ain't cut out for my mountain lady. You wouldn't last the ride up, let alone the winter. I need someone to chop wood, haul water, and skin hides. Not someone who's going to eat through my winter stores in a month and freeze to death by December." The townspeople gasped at his blunt cruelty. Clara's face drained of color, then flooded with a fierce, burning crimson. She had spent her entire 26 years in Boston being quietly judged, politely dismissed, and cruelly mocked by high society for her size. When her father, a modest bookkeeper, died of consumption, he had left her buried in debt. Her cruel Aunt Beatrice had tried to send her to the city workhouse. Clara had taken her very last pennies to buy a train ticket and a stagecoach fare across the country. She had absolutely nothing to go back to. If she got back on that coach, she would starve in the streets of San Francisco. Clara stepped forward, completely ignoring the thick mud soaking into her hem. She tilted her chin up, forcing herself to meet Theron's towering gaze. "I have a legally binding contract, Mr. McCall," she said, her voice ringing out clearly over the silent street. "I am your wife by proxy, signed by the magistrate in this very county. I do not care what you think of my appearance. I have nowhere else to go. You asked for a woman who would not run away. Well, look at me. Do I look like I am built for running?" A few of the miners chuckled, but Clara didn't break eye contact. "I can cook, I can clean, and I can endure," she continued. "Take me to your cabin. If I am dead by December, you can bury me yourself and save the agency fee. But I am not getting back on that coach." Theron stared down at her. He saw the tremble in her lower lip, but he also saw the iron resolve in her dark eyes. He was furiously angry, feeling trapped by his own proxy signature, but he didn't have the time to argue. The sun was dropping behind the peaks, and the temperature was already plunging. "Fine," Theron spat, turning on his heel. "Fetch your own trunk. I ain't your servant." It was a cruel test. The wooden trunk was massive, packed with everything Clara owned in the world. Theron swung up into his buckboard wagon, expecting her to weep or beg for help. Instead, Clara walked to the back of the stagecoach. She grasped the leather handles of her heavy trunk. Gritting her teeth, her broad face contorting with exertion, she dragged it through the thick mud. It took her 3 agonizing minutes of heaving and pushing to tip it over the tailgate of Theron's wagon. She was gasping for air, her dress ruined, but she climbed into the wooden seat beside him without saying a single word. Theron cracked the reins. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered, steering the horses toward the treacherous, steep trail leading into the darkening mountains. The ride was an hour of bone-rattling silence. The trail was narrow, flanked by sheer drop-offs that made Clara dizzy. The wind grew sharper, biting through her woolen coat like needles. She gripped the edge of the wooden seat, every bump sending a jolt of pain up her spine. Theron drove the horses relentlessly, intentionally taking the roughest paths, glancing sideways to see if she would cry out. She didn't. She stared straight ahead into the black timber, her jaw set. She had survived the polished cruelty of Boston. She would survive this scarred brute in the wilderness. Theron's cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering lodgepole pines. It was a sturdy structure of peeled logs, but as they pulled up in the twilight, Clara's heart sank. The place looked less like a home and more like a predator's den. Heavy elk antlers were nailed above the door, and dozens of animal hides were stretched on wooden hoops around the yard, stinking of raw flesh and lye. Theron hopped down, unhitched the horses, and pointed to the cabin. "Door's open. Your room is in the back. Don't touch my rifles." Clara managed to drag her exhausted, aching body down from the wagon. Once again, she was forced to drag her own trunk across the frozen dirt, up the wooden steps, and into the cabin. The interior was a disaster. It smelled sharply of wood smoke, wet dog, and stale grease. A single cast-iron stove sat in the corner, barely radiating heat. The floors were thick with dried mud and wood shavings. A massive muddy hound raised its head from a pile of rags, let out a low woof, and went back to sleep. Clara dragged her trunk to the back room. It was little more than a closet. The walls were unchinked in places, letting whistling drafts of freezing air cut directly into the space. The bed was a narrow wooden frame with a mattress stuffed with coarse hay, covered by a single thin, moth-eaten blanket. It was a room designed to break a person's spirit. Theron walked in, his massive frame filling the doorway. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the dim lantern light. "I wake up at 4, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I expect a fire in the stove and coffee boiling. Tomorrow you'll find a dozen grouse I shot hanging in the shed. They need plucking and gutting. Then I want the ashes cleared, the floor scrubbed, and water hauled from the creek. The buckets are on the porch. If you're too delicate for the work, the road back to town is completely downhill. I suggest you start walking now before the snow flies." Before Clara could answer, he turned and slammed the door behind him. Clara stood in the freezing, dark room. The cold was beginning to seep into her bones. Her body, heavy and unaccustomed to such brutal physical exertion, throbbed with agony. She sat heavily on the hay mattress, which crunched loudly under her weight. For a brief, terrible moment, a tear slipped down her cheek. She thought of her father, of his gentle voice reading poetry by the fire. She thought of how far she had fallen. But then she remembered the laughter of the townspeople. She remembered the cold, dismissive eyes of her Aunt Beatrice. She wiped the tear away with the back of her dirty hand. "No," Clara thought, "I will not give this mountain man the satisfaction." She did not undress. She wrapped herself in the moth-eaten blanket, piled her heavy coat on top of herself, and curled into a ball to preserve her body heat. Her size, often a curse in the modern world, was a blessing in the freezing dark. She had natural insulation that the frail previous brides had lacked. When Theron woke at 4 in the morning, the cabin was freezing. He swung his legs out of his loft bed, a grim smirk on his face. He fully expected to find the fat woman sobbing in her bed, begging to be taken back to town. He climbed down the wooden ladder, preparing a speech about how he had told her so. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. The cast-iron stove was roaring, glowing a dull orange with intense heat. The smell of strong, boiling coffee filled the cabin. Clara was already awake, her hair tied back beneath a practical cotton kerchief. She wore an oversized apron that covered her thick frame, and her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows. She turned as he approached, holding out a tin cup of steaming black coffee. "Good morning, Mr. McCall," she said calmly. "Your coffee. I found a slab of salt pork in the pantry and some dried apples. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. Theron took the cup mechanically, staring at her in bewilderment. He took a sip. It was the best coffee he had tasted in 5 years, strong, not burned, with a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. He scowled, confused by his own comfort, and immediately hardened his heart. "Don't expect praise for doing the bare minimum," he grunted, setting the cup down. "I'm going out to check the trap lines. I'll be back at dusk. I expect the grouse plucked, the floors clean, and the water hauled." He grabbed his rifle and stalked out into the pitch-black freezing morning, leaving Clara alone. The day that followed was an absolute nightmare for Clara. Plucking a dozen freezing grouse left her hands raw, numb, and covered in tiny cuts. Gutting them made her stomach heave, but she forced herself to endure it, carefully saving the feathers in a sack for future pillows. Scrubbing the floor was worse. Lowering her heavy frame to her hands and knees was painful. Getting back up was sheer agony. But she used hot water and harsh lye soap, scrubbing away years of Theron's bachelor filth until the raw pine floorboards shone clean. The ultimate test, however, was the water. The creek was a quarter-mile down a steep, treacherous incline. The wooden yokes and buckets were heavy, even when empty. Clara bundled up and made her way down to the icy water. Breaking the surface ice with a rock, she filled the buckets. As she began the hike back up, her lungs burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every step was a monumental effort. Halfway up, her boot slipped on a patch of black ice. Clara fell hard, her massive weight crashing down onto her right knee. The bucket spilled, freezing water soaking her skirt. She lay there in the snow, gasping in pain, staring at the gray sky. It would be so easy to just lay there, to freeze, to give up. "I'm a winter hog, am I?" she thought bitterly. Hogs survive the winter. Delicate flowers die. With a guttural groan, Clara rolled over, pushed herself up on her bruised knee, marched back down to the creek, and refilled the buckets. Theron tramped back into the clearing just as the last dying rays of the sun bled behind the mountains. His mood was foul. The traps had been empty, the wind was shifting to the north, a sure sign of a massive storm, and his wounded leg from the old bear attack was aching fiercely. He braced himself as he opened the cabin door, fully expecting to find a weeping mess of a woman sitting in a filthy room. He pushed the door open and stopped breathing. The cabin was unrecognizable. The floors were spotless. The dirty rags were gone, washed and hung neatly by the fire. The piles of junk in the corners had been organized. The hound was chewing happily on a boiled bone on a clean rug. But it was the smell that hit him the hardest. It wasn't the smell of scorched meat and grease he was used to. It was the rich, intoxicating aroma of a slow-simmered stew. Clara stood by the stove, stirring a massive black iron pot. She looked exhausted. Her face was smudged with soot, her skirt was stained with water, and she favored her right leg, but she stood tall. "Wipe your boots before you step inside, Mr. McCall," Clara said, not even turning around. Theron felt a bizarre mix of awe and immediate defensive anger. He wasn't used to being told what to do in his own home. He wasn't used to comfort. It made him feel vulnerable. He stomped inside, purposely leaving a trail of snow on her clean floor, and marched over to the pot. He peered inside. "What is this?" he demanded. "Grouse stew, with root vegetables and dried thyme I found in the back of the pantry." Theron slammed his fist on the wooden table. "You wasted my good salt. And the thyme? That was meant to last the winter. You think because you're hungry you can just eat up my stores in one day?" It was a lie. He had plenty of salt, but his pride demanded he find a flaw, a way to break her. Clara froze. She slowly took the wooden spoon out of the pot, laid it on a cloth, and turned to face him. The warmth of the cabin vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like snapping wire. "I used a single pinch of salt, Mr. McCall," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all its Boston polite polish. "And a dusting of thyme that was practically rotting in the tin. I spent 12 hours today breaking my back to turn this pigsty into a home. I scrubbed your floors on my hands and knees. I hauled your water. I plucked your birds. I am a fat woman, Mr. McCall, not a deaf one, and I am certainly not a fool. You will not raise your voice to me." Theron stared at her, utterly taken aback. No one spoke to him like that. Men in the saloon backed down from him. The previous brides had cowered, but this large, soot-stained woman was looking at him with eyes full of absolute hellfire. "You're in my house," Theron growled, taking a threatening step forward, trying to use his sheer size to intimidate her. "Then throw me out!" Clara roared back, slamming her own hands down on the table, leaning forward. She didn't shrink away from his massive chest. "Throw me into the snow, Theron, go ahead. If you want to be a miserable, lonely beast living in filth, then toss me out. But if you want to eat a hot meal, sit down and shut your mouth." For 10 agonizing seconds, the giant mountain man and the obese Bostonian woman glared at each other, chest to chest. Then, suddenly, the wind outside screamed. It wasn't a normal gust. It was a shrieking, violent howl that shook the very logs of the cabin. The heavy wooden shutters slammed violently against the windows. A massive blizzard, fierce and unseasonable, had struck the mountain with zero warning. The temperature plummeted so fast the frost instantly crept up the window panes. Theron broke eye contact, his survival instincts overriding his anger. "The barn," he cursed, turning toward the door. "The mules aren't tied down and the main door's loose. It'll tear off in this wind." He threw his heavy buffalo coat back on and shoved the cabin door open. The wind immediately blasted inside, nearly knocking Clara off her feet with a wall of blinding, driving snow. Theron plunged into the whiteout, vanishing instantly. Clara rushed to the door, fighting to push it shut against the gale. She dropped the heavy iron latch and stood shivering, listening to the demonic howling of the storm. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Clara paced the floor. She checked the window, but there was nothing to see but a wall of white. 15 minutes. Suddenly, she heard it, a dull, heavy thud against the front porch, then a low, agonizing groan that was barely audible over the wind. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw the latch and dragged the heavy door open. Theron was lying on the porch, covered in snow, desperately clawing at the wooden planks. The massive, heavy oak door of the barn had been ripped off its iron hinges by the wind, and it had come down directly on him. He had managed to crawl 30 yards through the blizzard, dragging his right leg behind him. It was twisted at a sickening angle, the bone fractured, blood soaking his heavy canvas trousers. He looked up at Clara, his face pale as death, his eyes rolling back. "Help!" he choked out before his head hit the wood and he lost consciousness. Clara stood in the freezing wind, assessing the situation. Theron McCall weighed 240 pounds of pure, dense muscle. He was dead weight. A delicate 90-pound mail-order bride would have been entirely useless. She would have frozen to death trying to move him, and they both would have died on that porch. But Clara was not a delicate bride. She stepped out into the howling storm, ignoring the biting cold. She reached under Theron's massive arms, locking her thick hands together behind his broad back. She planted her heavy boots firmly on the snowy porch. "Up!" Clara grunted, her broad shoulders bunching, using her immense weight to counterbalance his. With a roar of pure exertion, Clara heaved backward. Her thighs burned, her boots slipped, but her mass anchored her. Slowly, agonizingly, she dragged the giant mountain man across the threshold and into the cabin. She kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the deadly storm. Panting, her heart hammering, Clara looked down at the blood pooling on the clean floorboards. The man who had mocked her size now owed his life to it. She didn't panic. She grabbed her sewing scissors, a bottle of cheap whiskey from the shelf, and tore a clean bedsheet into strips. She was going to save this stubborn, cruel man, whether he wanted it or not. The wind battered the log walls, a relentless, shrieking force that threatened to tear the roof straight off the rafters. Inside, the cabin was a terrifying contrast of roaring heat from the stove and the metallic, coppery stench of fresh blood. Theron lay unconscious on the heavy braided rug, his breathing shallow and ragged. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, the floorboards groaning in protest. She had never set a bone in her life, but she had spent months nursing her dying father in Boston, watching doctors perform grim work in dim rooms. Panic was a luxury she simply could not afford. She took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hands, and went to work. Clara's triage. 1. Expose the wound. Using her heavy sewing shears, Clara cut away the thick blood-soaked canvas of Theron's right trouser leg. The sight made her stomach violently pitch. The fibula had snapped completely, a jagged piece of white bone pushing obscenely just beneath the bruised, unbroken skin. 2. Sterilization. She uncorked the cheap rye whiskey. Without hesitating, she poured a generous measure directly over the mangled leg, then took a long, burning swig herself to steady her nerves. 3. Prepare the splints. She scrambled to the wood box, selecting 2 straight, sturdy pieces of split pine kindling. She wrapped them in the clean strips of the torn bedsheet. "Lord, give me strength," Clara whispered into the stifling heat of the room. She straddled Theron's massive frame. She needed to pull the leg straight to align the bone before splinting it, a task that required immense physical power. If she were the 90-pound woman Theron had originally wanted, the task would have been mathematically impossible. But Clara was over 250 pounds of solid, anchored determination. She gripped his heavy leather boot with both hands. She planted her knees on either side of his hips, using her own substantial body weight as a stabilizing anchor against his torso. She threw her weight backward and yanked the leg straight. A sickening crunch echoed in the small cabin as the bone slipped back into place. Instantly, Theron's eyes flew open. A roar of pure, unadulterated agony ripped from his throat, loud enough to rival the blizzard outside. His massive hands flew up, instinctively grabbing Clara by the shoulders, his grip like iron vices. "Hold still!" Clara shouted, leaning her full weight down on his chest, pinning him to the floorboards. "If you move, it will slip, and you will lose the leg, Theron. Do you hear me? You will lose it." Wild, fevered eyes stared up at her. The mountain man was entirely delirious with pain, thrashing like a trapped grizzly. But Clara did not budge. She absorbed his blows, her broad frame immovable, her weight pinning him down until the shock overtook his system once more, and he slumped back into unconsciousness. Panting, her clothes soaked in sweat and blood, Clara quickly lashed the pine splints to his leg, tying the sheet strips tight. For the next 3 days, the blizzard raged. The cabin became an island suspended in a sea of white death. Clara barely slept. She dragged Theron's heavy mattress from the loft down to the main floor, another feat of brute strength, and rolled him onto it. She kept the fire burning, melting snow for water when the buckets ran dry, and spooning cold grouse stew past his parched, fever-chapped lips. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. The eerie silence of the mountain woke Theron. He blinked against the harsh sunlight, reflecting off the snow outside the frosted window. His mouth tasted like old copper and rye. He tried to move his right leg and hissed in pain, looking down to see the sturdy, perfectly tied splint. Then he looked across the room. Clara was asleep in a wooden rocking chair by the stove. She looked battered. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her thick hands were raw and blistered from endless hours of chopping wood indoors to feed the stove. She was snoring softly, wrapped in his heavy buffalo coat. Theron stared at her. He remembered the agony, but more vividly, he remembered the terrifying, undeniable strength of the woman pinning him to the floor, her voice cutting through the haze of his pain, saving his life. The shame of his earlier cruelty burned hotter than his fever. By late November, a grim routine had settled over the cabin. Theron was entirely bedridden, forced into a humiliating state of dependency. The man who had conquered the Bitterroots could not even make it to the outhouse without Clara's broad shoulder, supporting his immense weight. To her credit, Clara never gloated. She simply stepped into the void his injury created. The transition was not easy. Clara had to learn to operate Theron's heavy Sharps rifle, a weapon that kicked so hard it bruised her collarbone black and blue. She waded through waist-deep snow to check the closest trap lines, occasionally returning with an emaciated rabbit. Their situation was becoming rapidly dire. The lost week during the blizzard meant Theron hadn't secured their primary winter meat supply. Cabin inventory, December 1st, 1882, provision remaining quantity. Estimated duration, salt pork, 4 lbs, 1.5 weeks. Flour, 10 lbs, weevil infested, 2 weeks dried apples, 1 small tin, 5 days coffee, 1 2-pound, 2 weeks firewood, 2 cords, chopped, 1 month. Note, with an injured man requiring calories to heal, the rations were entirely insufficient to survive until the spring thaw in April. One freezing Tuesday, as Clara was outside chopping firewood, the heavy axe swinging rhythmically in her blistered hands, the sound of crunching snow broke the silence. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow, and turned. Riding up the trail on a shaggy gray horse was Josiah Trent. Josiah was a notorious fur trapper from the neighboring ridge, a man known in Orofino for his missing teeth, his foul odor, and his complete lack of moral compass. He had a long-standing territorial feud with Theron. Josiah pulled his horse to a halt, his dark eyes sweeping over the snowed-in cabin, then settling on Clara. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "Well, well," Josiah sneered, a greasy smile stretching across his face. "Heard Elias Miller hauled a prize hog up the mountain for McCall. Looks like the rumors were true. Where's the big man? Frozen stiff in his bed?" "Mr. McCall is resting," Clara said coolly, resting the head of the heavy axe on the chopping block, keeping her hand firmly gripped on the hickory handle. "Resting?" Josiah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Theron McCall don't rest, not unless he's dead or dying. I saw the barn door blown to kindling. I know he ain't checked his far lines in a month. I figure this ridge is open territory now." Josiah swung down from his horse. He took a step toward the cabin, his hand resting casually on the revolver strapped to his hip. "I think I'll just step inside, warm my boots, and take a look at his pelts. Maybe keep his widow company." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of pure stone. She knew exactly what Josiah was. He was a scavenger. If he saw Theron crippled in bed, he would slit the man's throat, steal their remaining supplies, and leave her to the wolves. As Josiah took another step, Clara moved. She didn't retreat toward the door. Instead, she stepped directly into his path, blocking the porch steps with her massive frame. She hefted the heavy wood-splitting axe, holding it comfortably in both hands. "You take one more step toward my door, Mr. Trent," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm, "and I will split you from your crown to your collarbone, and then I will feed you to the hound." Josiah froze. He looked at the axe, then up at Clara's dark, unblinking eyes. He realized instantly that she was not bluffing. She was heavily built, heavily armed, and completely unbothered by the cold. "You're crazy, woman," Josiah muttered, taking a slow step backward, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I am a Bostonian," Clara corrected him coldly. "Now get off our ridge." Josiah scrambled back onto his horse, cursing under his breath, and spurred the animal back down the mountain. Clara stood in the snow, watching him until he disappeared into the pines, before she finally let out a long, shaky breath and collapsed against the porch railing. Inside the cabin, Theron had dragged himself across the floor, his rifle clutched in his hands, sweating profusely from the pain. He had heard the entire exchange through the thin window pane. He lowered the rifle as Clara walked back inside, brushing the snow from her skirt. He stared at her, seeing her not as a liability, not as a mail-order mistake, but as an absolute fortress of a woman. "He'll be back," Theron rasped, pulling himself back up onto the mattress with agonizing effort. "Once he figures we're starving, he'll bring friends." "Then we will not starve," Clara replied firmly, walking over to the stove to pour him a cup of hot water. "And if he brings friends, I will sharpen the other axe." By Christmas Eve, the threat of starvation had moved from a distant fear to a physical presence in the room. The flour was gone. The salt pork was a memory. They were surviving on boiled pine needles for vitamin C and the stringy, flavorless meat of the occasional squirrel Clara managed to trap near the shed. Clara's clothes were beginning to hang loosely on her frame. The brutal labor and lack of food were melting the weight off her, but it was a dangerous, hollow kind of loss. Theron, requiring immense energy to knit the fractured bone together, was growing pale and gaunt. That night, the temperature plummeted to 40 below zero. The sap in the pine trees outside froze and exploded with sounds like musket fire. Clara had dragged her own thin mattress from the freezing back room and placed it near the stove, only a few feet away from Theron's bed. It was a matter of survival. Body heat and proximity to the fire were all that kept them alive. The darkness in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the dim orange glow of the stove grates. "Why didn't you leave?" Theron's voice broke the silence, raspy and low. Clara turned her head. She could see the silhouette of his scarred face in the dim light. "I told you on the first day, Mr. McCall. I had a legally binding contract." "Contract be damned," Theron scoffed softly, a dry, bitter sound. "Henrietta had a contract. She ran the second I raised my voice. Mary took one look at my face and thought the devil himself had come to collect her. I treated you worse than a stray dog, Clara. Why did you stay?" Clara lay quietly for a long moment, listening to the popping wood. "Because I know what it is to be a monster in the eyes of the world, Theron," she whispered finally, the raw honesty of the dark drawing the truth from her. "You wear your scars on your face. I wear mine on my waistline." Theron shifted, wincing as his leg throbbed. "You ain't a monster." "Society disagrees," Clara said, a bitter smile touching her lips in the dark. "In Boston, a woman of my size is a spectacle, a joke. My Aunt Beatrice used to lock me in the pantry when important guests came over, so I wouldn't offend their sensibilities. I was invisible, yet I took up too much space. When my father died, the debt collectors laughed at me. They said no man would ever marry a workhorse, so I belonged in the poorhouse. I came to this mountain because I thought, just maybe, the wilderness wouldn't care what I looked like, so long as I worked hard." Theron was silent for a long time. The admission struck him squarely in the chest. "Abigail," he said suddenly, his voice thick with an old buried grief. "Who?" "My fiancée, back in St. Louis 7 years ago." Theron reached up, his rough fingers tracing the 3 thick, jagged scars that tore across his left cheek. I was a handsome man once, vain even. I came out west to make my fortune in fur, to build a grand house for her. A grizzly sow caught me by the river, tore my face open, crushed my ribs. It took me 6 months to heal enough to ride back to Missouri. He swallowed hard, the memory still possessing the power to choke him. When I walked through her front door, she screamed. She looked at me like I was a rotting corpse. She had already married a banker, told me she couldn't possibly be seen in polite society with a hideous brute. So I came back here, built this cabin, decided if the world thought I was a monster, I'd live like one. I sent for a bride because I needed a worker, but I pushed them away because I couldn't bear to see that look of disgust in another woman's eyes. Theron turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's in the dim light. You never looked at me like that, Clara, not once. Because I only see a man, Clara answered softly, a stubborn, infuriating, immensely foolish man. But just a man. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was a profound, settling peace. For the first time in his life, Theron felt the thick, heavy armor around his heart begin to crack. The woman lying a few feet away, whom he had cruelly mocked on the boardwalk in Orofino, had saved his life, defended his home, and understood his deepest shame. But the tender moment was brutally interrupted by the reality of the frontier. A loud, hollow rumble echoed from Theron's stomach. Clara let out a short, tired laugh, her own stomach violently agreeing. We are starving, Theron, she said, the stark reality killing the warmth of the moment. The traps are empty. We have a handful of coffee grounds and 1 potato left. Theron's face hardened, his survival instincts taking over. He calculated the distance to town, his broken leg, the snow depth. It was a death sentence to try and leave. Tomorrow, Theron said, his voice grim. Tomorrow you have to take the rifle. You have to climb up to the high ridge. There's a wintering ground for elk up there. If you don't shoot an elk, Clara, we won't live to see January. Clara stared at the ceiling, her heart turning to ice. She had never shot a living creature in her life. But as she listened to the howling wind outside, she knew the time for hesitation was over. She would climb the ridge, she would hunt, or they would die together in the snow. Dawn on Christmas Day, 1882, did not bring light to the Bitterroot Mountains. It only brought a pale, freezing gray that illuminated the falling snow. The temperature hovered at a deadly 45 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, Clara wrapped herself in 3 layers of woolen skirts, 2 flannel shirts, and Theron's heavy buffalo hide coat. She looked like a mountain herself, a broad, unmovable force of wool, leather, and grim determination. Theron lay propped against the pillows, his face drawn and gray from malnourishment. He held out his prized possession, an 1874 Sharps buffalo rifle, chambered in .45-70. The weapon weighed 12 pounds and had a recoil that could dislocate a man's shoulder if he wasn't braced. The sights are dialed for 100 yards, Theron instructed, his voice weak but his eyes intensely focused. You pull the rear trigger first to set the mechanism. The front trigger is a hair pull. Do not touch it until you are ready to kill. If you miss, the sound will scatter the herd into the next valley, and you won't get a second chance. Clara took the heavy rifle. The cold steel bit through her thick woolen mittens. I understand. Clara, Theron said, grabbing her wrist with a sudden desperate strength. The high ridge is 2 miles up, and the snow is waist deep in the drifts. Your heart. It ain't used to this altitude. My heart is stronger than you think, Theron, she replied softly. She turned and walked out into the freezing maw of the wilderness. The climb was an exercise in pure, agonizing torture. Every step required Clara to lift her heavy, snow-caked boots out of drifts that sucked at her legs like freezing mud. Her lungs burned as if she were inhaling shattered glass. By the time she reached the first plateau, her massive frame was drenched in freezing sweat beneath the heavy coat. A dainty woman would have frozen to death from the exposure, but Clara's thick layers of natural fat insulated her core, keeping her blood pumping, keeping her alive. It took her 3 hours to reach High Ridge. The wind here was a physical blow, howling across the jagged granite peaks. Clara dropped to her stomach, ignoring the agonizing cold seeping into her chest, and crawled to the edge of the snowy precipice. Below, in a small, sheltered box canyon, a herd of elk was pawing at the snow to reach the dormant yellow grass beneath. Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slid the heavy barrel of the sharps over a snow-covered log. She singled out a large, solitary cow elk on the edge of the herd. "Pull the rear trigger," she repeated Theron's instructions in her head. Click. She nestled the heavy wooden stock tight against her shoulder, burying it in the thick meat of her shoulder pocket. She closed her left eye and aligned the iron sights behind the elk's front shoulder, aiming for the heart and lungs. Her finger grazed the front trigger. She held her breath, stopping the clouds of white vapor escaping her lips. The world went dead silent. Boom! The roar of the 45-70 was deafening, echoing like cannon fire across the peaks. The recoil slammed into Clara like a kicking mule, bruising her collarbone instantly, but her sheer mass absorbed the shock, keeping the barrel from kicking wildly into the air. Down in the canyon, the herd exploded into a frantic sprint. But the cow elk took 2 stumbling steps and collapsed in the deep snow. Clara dropped her head into the snow and sobbed. It was a single gasping cry of relief. They were not going to starve, but killing the animal was only half the battle. Theron had instructed her on the brutal reality of field dressing. When Clara reached the carcass, the smell of hot blood and raw organs made her gorge rise. She drew her hunting knife. She had never butchered anything larger than a Boston market chicken. For 2 hours, working with bare, blood-slicked hands in the sub-zero temperatures, Clara gutted and quartered the massive animal. She lashed the heavy hindquarters and the prized backstraps to a makeshift sled she had woven from green pine boughs. Just as she was tying the final knot, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slowly. 30 yards away, stepping silently out of the timber, was a massive mountain lion. The cougar was gaunt, its ribs showing through its tawny coat, its yellow eyes locked onto the bloody elk meat. It let out a low, terrifying hiss, bearing fangs designed to crush bone. Clara was exhausted. Her arms felt like lead, but the thought of Theron starving in that cabin, waiting for her, ignited a primal, unyielding rage in her chest. She did not run. She did not scream. Clara dropped the sled rope, picked up the heavy Sharps rifle, and quickly loaded another massive brass cartridge into the breech. She snapped the lever shut with a sharp clack. Instead of backing away, Clara stepped forward. She raised the rifle, firing a shot directly into the snow mere inches from the cougar's front paws. The explosion threw a geyser of ice and dirt into the cat's face. "Mine!" Clara roared, her voice tearing from her throat with the ferocity of a wild beast, echoing off the canyon walls. "This is mine, you son of a bitch! Get back!" The mountain lion, terrified by the thunderous noise and the sheer, aggressive size of the blood-soaked human advancing on it, turned and vanished into the trees like a ghost. Clara stood panting, the smoking rifle in her hands. She was no longer a polite, humiliated Boston spinster. She was a woman of the Bitterroots. The sun was dropping fast as Clara dragged the makeshift sled into the clearing of the cabin. The physical toll of pulling nearly 200 pounds of raw meat down the mountain had pushed her to the absolute limits of human endurance. Her vision was blurring, and her legs felt like hollow wood. But as she approached the porch, her blood ran cold. There were 2 strange horses hitched to the post. The heavy oak door of the cabin was standing wide open, letting the freezing wind pour inside. Clara dropped the sled rope. She checked the breech of the Sharps. It was loaded. She moved silently up the wooden steps, pressing her back against the exterior logs. From inside, she heard the harsh, mocking laughter of Josiah Trent. "It's perfectly legal, McCall," Josiah was saying, his voice dripping with venom. "You missed your property tax filing in Lewiston. Clerk Thomas Pendleton at the assayer's office is a good friend of mine. When you didn't show up by December 15th, the state declared this ridge abandoned. I paid the back taxes. I own this cabin now. I own your traps. And by the look of that rotting leg, I won't have to wait long to own your grave." "You're a coward, Josiah," Theron's voice rasped, weak but laced with pure hatred. "You knew I was crippled. Smart, not cowardly, another voice chuckled. Clara recognized Burl Dawson, a known hired gun and cattle rustler from Orofino. Now, where's that fat wife of yours? We figure we'll run her off the mountain, but maybe she knows where you hid your winter gold stash first. Clara stepped fully into the doorway, the heavy Sharps rifle raised and braced against her shoulder. Josiah and Burl spun around, their hands diving for their holstered revolvers. They froze instantly. Clara looked like an avenging angel of death. She was covered from the chest down in dark, freezing elk blood. Her face was smudged with soot and gore, and her eyes were burning with an intensity that made both hardened outlaws instinctively take a step back. She filled the entire doorframe, a massive, imposing figure with the barrel of the buffalo rifle aimed directly at Josiah's chest. "If you touch that iron, Mr. Trent," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly monotone, "I will blow a hole through you so large the snow will blow through it." Josiah swallowed hard, his hand hovering over his Colt. Now, Mrs. McCall, let's be reasonable. I got a legal deed here from Thomas Pendleton himself. This land is mine. My husband, Clara said, emphasizing the word with a fierce pride, signed a proxy marriage contract filed with the territorial judge in October. That legally bound his assets to his spouse. You cannot claim an abandoned property if the legal spouse is actively residing on it. Your deed from Pendleton is a fraudulent claim, Mr. Trent, and I will happily ride to Orofino and show it to Judge Harlan Davis, but before I do that, I will shoot you both. Burl Dawson slowly raised his hands in surrender. Josiah, she's got that big Sharps on a hair trigger. I ain't dying over a log cabin. Drop your guns, Clara commanded. Josiah hesitated, staring at the giant, blood-soaked woman. He saw no bluff in her eyes. With a curse, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the floorboards. Burl did the same. Now, Clara said, stepping aside just enough to let them pass. You broke my door. You trespassed in my home. As compensation, I am seizing your horses. You will walk back down this mountain on foot. Josiah's eyes bulged. Walk? It's dark. It's 30 below. We'll freeze to death before we hit the valley. Then you had better start walking very fast, Clara replied coldly. She did not flinch as the two men, muttering vicious curses, squeezed past her and hurried off the porch, plunging into the freezing, darkening timber. Clara shut the heavy door, dropping the iron latch. She turned to look at Theron. He was propped up on his elbows, staring at her in absolute awe. I got an elk, Clara said, her voice finally trembling as the adrenaline crashed out of her system. She leaned the rifle against the wall and sank to the floor, completely spent. Theron dragged himself off his mattress, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He dragged himself across the floorboards until he reached her. He reached out with a scarred, trembling hand and cupped Clara's soot-stained, blood-streaked face. You magnificent, beautiful woman, Theron whispered, tears pooling in his dark eyes. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a polite, tentative kiss. It was a fierce, desperate joining of two survivors, a sealing of a bond forged in ice and blood. The winter of 1883 broke with an agonizing slowness, the relentless, suffocating grip of the ice finally yielding to the warm, prevailing Chinook winds blowing up from the valleys. By late April, the deep snowdrifts on the Bitterroots began to melt into rushing, crystal-clear streams that roared down the canyons, carrying away the ghosts of the hardest winter the territory had seen in a decade. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The bitter tension and cold cruelty of those early days were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound warmth that had nothing to do with the cast-iron stove. They had survived on the elk Clara had brought down from the high ridge, the rich meat providing the vital strength Theron needed to heal. His leg had fused back together. It wasn't a perfect mend. He walked with a heavy limp and required a thick, carved hickory cane to cross the uneven ground. But he was alive, and the jagged white scars on his face no longer twisted into a scowl when he looked at his wife. Clara had changed just as drastically. The brutal physical labor, the days of starvation, and the harsh elements had melted away some of her weight, but she remained a large, deeply formidable woman. However, The soft, nervous flesh of the humiliated Boston spinster had been forged into solid, unyielding frontier muscle. Her arms were corded from swinging axes and hauling water yokes. Her face had lost its pale, sickly pallor and was deeply tanned from the mountain sun, her dark eyes bright, sharp, and utterly fearless. She had finally found her true shape, not the delicate, fragile frame that polite society demanded, but the powerful, sturdy vessel of a frontier survivor. On a bright, fragrant morning in early May, Theron hitched their 2 mules, which Clara had stubbornly recovered from the woods after the blizzard, to the buckboard wagon. He limped around the front of the rig, bracing his weight on his cane, and offered his large, calloused hand to help Clara up onto the wooden seat. He didn't just assist her. His hand lingered tenderly on her sturdy waist. "You ready for this?" Theron asked, a fierce, protective edge in his gravelly voice. He knew exactly what the town had thought of her, and he was prepared to burn Orofino to the ground if they looked at her crossways. "I am Mrs. Theron McCall," Clara smiled, adjusting her practical cotton sunbonnet. She looked down at him, her gaze unwavering. "I am ready for absolutely anything." The ride down the mountain was vastly different from the agonizing, bone-rattling climb 7 months prior. The valleys were exploding with vivid green, dotted with vast patches of purple lupin and yellow arrowleaf balsam root. When the wagon finally rattled out of the timber and onto the muddy, bustling main street of Orofino, it was as if time simply ground to a halt. Miners stepped out of the dark, smoky saloons, their whiskey glasses freezing halfway to their mouths. Women in calico dresses paused on the wooden boardwalks, their parasols dropping. Outside the assayer's office, Elias Miller, the stagecoach driver who had brought Clara to town the previous autumn, dropped a wooden crate of apples straight into the muddy street. Everyone in Orofino had assumed Theron McCall was dead. When Josiah Trent had stumbled into town half-frozen on Christmas night, raving like a madman about a giant, blood-soaked witch holding him at gunpoint with a buffalo rifle, the town had laughed him out of the saloon, assuming he was hallucinating from frostbite. As Theron pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Amos Cartwright's Mercantile, low murmurs rippled through the stunned crowd. Theron climbed down, leaning heavily on his cane, and offered his hand to Clara. She took it and stepped down, her heavy boots planting firmly in the mud. She wore a simple, clean wool dress, but she carried herself with the undeniable, overwhelming presence of a queen inspecting her lands. The silence was broken by a drunk, gap-toothed prospector named Hiram Cobb, who leaned over the rail of the Golden Nugget Saloon and sneered loudly. "Well, I'll be damned to hell," Hiram slurred, pointing a grimy finger. "The scarred devil didn't freeze after all, and his winter hog didn't run away. Must be she ate all his winter stores to stay that big." A few of the rougher men on the boardwalk chuckled, expecting the scarred giant to hang his head in shame, as he had always done when townspeople stared at his mangled face. Theron didn't shout. He didn't lose his temper or flush red. He simply let go of Clara's hand, handed her the reins, and walked with absolute, terrifying purpose through the thick mud. He didn't even use his cane. He crossed the street, grabbed Hiram by his filthy canvas collar, and with a single heave of his massive shoulders, hauled the man entirely over the wooden rail. He slammed Hiram face first into the muddy street with a sickening thud. Before anyone could blink, Theron drew his heavy Colt revolver from his hip and pointed it directly down at the trembling, mud-soaked man. The street went deathly silent. You could hear the wind whistling through the telegraph wires. "That woman!" Theron's voice boomed over the street, carrying the lethal authority of a rolling avalanche. "Is my wife. She dragged me onto a porch in the middle of a blizzard when my leg was shattered. She set my bones with her bare hands. She climbed the high ridge and hunted elk at 40 below zero so I wouldn't starve. And she stood down 2 armed outlaws with a buffalo rifle to protect our home." He cocked the hammer of the Colt. The metallic click echoed loudly. "She is worth 10 of any man in this miserable, mud-soaked town," Theron continued, his dark eyes sweeping over the terrified crowd, daring any man to challenge him. "If I hear one more word of disrespect toward her size, her looks, or her name, I will put you all in the ground. Are we clear?" Hiram nodded frantically, spitting bloody mud, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. The rest of the town looked away, suddenly finding the boardwalk planks fascinating. Theron uncocked his weapon, holstered it smoothly, and walked back to where Clara was standing. She hadn't shrunk away. She hadn't covered her face. She was glowing with a fierce, burning pride. Theron gently offered his arm. "Shall we, Mrs. McCall?" "We shall, Mr. McCall," Clara beamed, looping her thick, strong arm through his. They walked directly past the gaping townspeople to the office of Judge Harlan Davis. The judge, a stern, pragmatic man with thick white whiskers, looked up from his ledgers in utter shock as the scarred giant and his imposing, radiant wife filled his small office. "Judge," Theron said softly, respectfully placing his wide-brimmed hat on the wooden desk. "We have a proxy contract on file from last October. We're here to make it a real marriage. I want a real certificate signed today." Judge Davis blinked, recovering his wits, and smiled warmly. He pulled a fresh, heavy parchment certificate from his drawer. "It would be my profound honor, Theron." Standing in that dusty little office, they didn't need a congregation or a choir. Theron looked up into Clara's deep brown eyes. "I take you, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I take you exactly as you are. You saved my life, but more than that, you saved my soul." "And I take you, Theron," Clara replied, her voice steady and clear, reaching out to trace the jagged white scars on his cheek that had once terrified the world. Scars, stubbornness, mountain, and all. That afternoon, Theron escorted Clara to Amos Cartwright's mercantile. Amos was practically stumbling over his own boots, desperate to appease the man who had just cowed the entire town. Theron didn't buy flour and salt pork. He slammed a heavy leather pouch of saved gold dust onto the counter. He bought Clara the finest bolts of deep emerald silk and ivory lace the store possessed. He bought imported Swiss chocolate that had come up from San Francisco, a jar of spiced peaches, and a delicate, beautifully engraved silver locket. Clara protested the extravagant expense, whispering that they needed practical goods, but Theron simply kissed her forehead. "You have been practical all winter, Clara. Today, you are cherished." When they finally rode back up the mountain trail that evening, the sun was setting, casting a brilliant, fiery golden hue over the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. The cabin came into view, standing strong and defiant in the clearing, a thin plume of wood smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney. It was no longer a predator's den, cold, filthy, and isolated. It was a home, fiercely defended and deeply loved. Clara leaned her head against Theron's broad shoulder. He wrapped his thick, muscular arm around her sturdy waist, pulling her close against him as the mules plodded the final few yards. They had both been cast out by a civilized society that valued superficial perfection over genuine substance. But up here, on the harsh, unforgiving spine of the world, they had found exactly what they were looking for. The wilderness didn't care about the scars on a man's face, and it certainly didn't care about the size of a woman's waistline. It only cared about strength, unyielding loyalty, and the fierce, beautiful will to survive together. Clara and Theron's story proves that true strength isn't measured by society's shallow standards, but by the fire in a person's soul when the darkest winter sets in. The scarred mountain man and the woman they mocked as a winter hog built a legendary life in the Bitterroots, leaving behind a legacy of survival and unbreakable devotion. If this incredible tale of frontier grit, unexpected romance, and brutal justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video so we can bring you more untold frontier stories.